But see, 25 years ago, nobody was talking about autism in adults.
Mm.
The spectrum had just been, maybe it was 3 or 4 years out. They were mainly focusing on children and, getting them the proper services for their educations. There was even a group that was just hell bent on finding why this is happening. And in fact, we've had people on the spectrum forever. And some of our greatest contributors, greatest artists, greatest scientists have been neurodivergent. But it all began to explain Alvin to me. He was a very good TV repairman. He was laser focused on that when he did it. Nobody had any complaints about him in that part of his life. But at the same time, when things started falling apart, meaning his father's death from pancreatic cancer, his mother's death a few years later, and then his wife's death, he began to lash out, continue to lash out because he had been lashing out in all the civil litigation. And he was I realized he's like a scared child and always has been. Now, I continued, and my subsequent secretaries continued to help Alvin when he needed help, just figuring out things. And I began to realize all of that was probably spectrum related. So, with his permission, of course, I took him to Atlanta. He wanted me to sit in on part of it. The doctor said, I want to make some statements, and you tell me your reaction to these statements. She's gotten under your skin. Oh, Alvin seemed physically disturbed by the notion of someone getting under your skin. He was thinking it very literally. It made me realize back in the trial, which, by the way, the plan was for Alvin not to testify, but Jesus appeared and told him to testify. I got overruled by Jesus. I'm one of the lawyers who can say I got overruled by Jesus. And after a brief coaching, because I had not planned on him testifying, Alvin testified. And I just let him tell it all because that's what I was worried about. Trying to talk to him about his wife and he talking about a van. That's what I wanted to avoid. But now the jury had heard so much about him. I just wanted to let them see his Rube Goldberg mechanism of causation from point A to point Z, and just to know how he thinks. Well, a couple of funny things happened. One is I realized that Alvin had had many lawyers over the years starting these civil lawsuits, and then they would either quit or he would fire them. And so I realized that I'm about to get him to the end of a trial. And I was kind of proud of that. And I said, Mr. Ridley, as a matter of fact, I'm the first lawyer that you've ever kept from the beginning of a matter to the end. And in perfect comic timing, he said, so far. In other words, I could get fired any minute. And the jurors were laughing. And I thought, okay, this is a murder trial. And he's actually charming them. But I would forget, and I would get way ahead of myself, and I wanted to finish strong. And I said, Alvin, tell the jurors what you lost here. And I was wanting him to say, the love of my life, the only friend I had in the world. But Alvin very literally thought, oh, well, I guess the funeral bill. That's what he was thinking of, what his loss was.
A financial loss, yeah.
A financial loss only. And so I just thought, this guy's so literal. Why do I forget that? So now, 23 years later, I'm shaking my head and thinking, oh, the second phrase that the doctor said was, he wears his heart on his sleeve. And Alvin jumped up and said, I know, he's got an artificial heart. Well, Alvin had seen my insulin pump. I became diabetic when I was in the Georgia legislature. That was another one of my kind of great losses that I was grieving at the end of my congressional race loss, that suddenly I had a health loss. And so I would always joke that I had my pancreas in my pocket. And I think Alvin thought, I know what that is. That means he's got his heart on his sleeve, an artificial heart. So it turned out Alvin is very much on the autistic spectrum, which began immediately to explain everything. And as I wrote this book, some stuff started creeping in. I've always heard that the best way to write a book is to write what they call a vomit draft. Just throw up everything onto the screen, and then you can edit it out later. And so I was truly doing that. And while I was doing it, I was realizing there was a lot of crap from my childhood getting in. And it turned out writing this book was like the best therapy ever, because I was just purging myself of all of these things. I had a very loving family, but a very severely alcoholic father. He was never mean. He was never abusive to any of us or my mother. But he was just sad and not there so much of our childhood. And I began to realize that the worst attributes of myself were very possibly from that. And that is that I'm a bit of a micromanager, that I want everything to go smoothly. Because as a child, you look inward when you wonder why your parent is, abusing a substance. You think, what am I doing to make them want to drink and conk out, before, I can have a decent conversation with them.
Yeah.
So you just look inward, and I think my worst traits were running head on with Alvin's neurodivergent mannerisms. His autistic traits were being used against him at trial. His flat vocal effect, the fact that his emotions did not seem to meet the moment. Oh, his wife just died and he's just, talking in a normal voice. Well, the thing with Alvin that I learned, I would catch he would almost absorb emotions for a while, and then there would be a release. And people with an autistic person in their family knows this very well, the meltdown. But Alvin would absorb all kinds of emotion. Years later, when my parents died, about 10 years apart, Alvin would come and pay his respects and be normal and fine. And the next time he was with me, I reminded him that my parents died, and he would have a meltdown. And I never understood why this was happening. There are 5.5 million undiagnosed neurodivergent people, adults. And, we're catching it in school children now. We're catching it and getting them services. But there's generations still living that did not get that treatment. Alvin's fourth grade teacher told me around the time of the trial that he cried every day of fourth grade, that he was just so difficult a child to adapt and adjust. And so I'm, as a lawyer, I now have a young man who's on the spectrum who, it's a processing issue. And if a police officer comes at you with slang, which everybody uses slang in their language, reach for the sky, would be very confusing to a neurodivergent person. Hit the ground. That would be totally confusing. And much like the things in my frustration, I would bark out at Alvin, and he just would stare at me. It was a processing issue. And I had a processing issue. I could not process Alvin. And of course, it was a conflict with my neurodiversity, my neurodiversity, my micromanagement, and his neurodiversity. And so I so understand it now. I feel a great bit of guilt about my ignorance with him. And I detailed that in the book. And I say that I felt guilty sometimes, and I didn't know why, but I felt guilty, for example, for in my frustration telling them I wish he would go take a bath. Alvin doesn't like the feel of water on his skin.
Mm.
That's part of his neurodivergence. And the minute I said it, I felt bad because, and interestingly enough, a skunk got into my office the day after I challenged him on his odor, sprayed all of the case files, sprayed me, and I show up to court for a couple of days smelling like a skunk. And Alvin got to complain about how I smelled. And so it made me realize we can't always help our circumstances.